The frost came early that year to Larkspur Hollow, settling over the valley before the last hay was even cut. By the second week of November, the ground rang hard under a boot heel, and the creek that ran along the eastern fence had gone still and glassy at its edges. She was in the corral when the gelding threw her. It was not a bad fall. She landed on her shoulder in the churned mud. The wind knocked clean out of her, and she lay there a moment, looking up at a sky the color of a nickel, before she made herself stand. 3 men from the feed store had stopped their wagon on the road to watch. They did not offer to help. They rarely did anymore. She was 31 years old, and she had buried her husband 9 months before, in April, when the ground was soft enough to dig without breaking a pick. Since then, the ranch had come apart the way things come apart when there is only one pair of hands to hold them together. A north fence sagging in 3 places, a roof that wept in the pantry corner when it rained, 4 horses that had gone half wild from lack of proper handling, because she had neither the time nor the arm strength to gentle them herself. There was also the note at the bank in Cedarville, 11 miles south, with her husband's signature on it and a date circled in the ledger that she did not let herself think about after breakfast. She dusted the mud from her coat and did not look at the men on the wagon again. They drove on. That was the state of things on the afternoon the drifter came up the road on a bay horse that had seen better winters, leading a second horse behind him that was not his. He stopped at the gate. He did not come through it. He sat there with his hat low against the wind and waited until she crossed the yard toward him, because that was the courtesy the fence line demanded, whatever else was true. "Afternoon," he said. She did not answer right away. She was looking at the horse he was leading, a rangy chestnut mare, one of the wild ones from the upper pasture that had slipped its rope back in October and that she had given up chasing. "That's mine," she said. "Found her loose on the county road. Figured she belonged somewhere close." He nodded past her, toward the barn, the sagging fence beyond it, the 4 horses, standing bunched and skittish near the far rail. "Looks like you've got more of that kind than you can manage." "I manage. Didn't say you didn't." The wind moved between them. Somewhere behind her, the pantry roof ticked with cold. She was aware, in the way a tired person is aware of things, that she had not eaten since morning, and that her shoulder had begun to throb in earnest where the ground had caught it. "I don't have work to pay a man," she said. "Didn't ask for pay." He swung down off the bay, unhurried, and set his boots in the frozen mud, like a man arriving somewhere he intended to stay a while. "Let me sleep in your barn. I'll break your horses." She studied him the way she might study weather, for what it would cost her, not for what it promised. "I don't know you," she said. "No. Don't know your name." He didn't offer it. He stood there with the bay's reins loose in one hand and the chestnut mare's rope in the other, and the cold came down through the yard like something settling in for good, and he waited the way a man waits, who has learned that waiting costs him nothing. She looked past him at the barn. The door hung crooked on its top hinge. She had been meaning to fix it since September. "Barn's not much," she said. "No stove in it. I've slept colder. That a fact?" "It is." She wanted to ask him what he wanted, what a man traveling alone in December wanted with 4 half-wild horses and a widow's falling down fence line. But she had learned that some questions only fed themselves, grew larger the longer you let them sit unanswered, and she did not have the strength tonight to hold anything larger than what stood in front of her. "There's a lean-to off the east wall," she said finally. "Out of the wind, mostly. You'd have to clear it. I can clear it. I feed the horses at first light. You'd be up before that if you want to start. I generally am." She turned then, favoring the shoulder, and started for the house without looking to see if he followed. Behind her she heard the mare's hooves shift in the frozen dirt, heard him speak to it low, not words exactly, just a sound pitched to settle something skittish. It worked faster than she expected. She did not turn around to watch. At the porch, she stopped with her hand on the rail. "There's stew from yesterday. Not much of it. Don't need much." "I didn't ask if you needed it." He almost smiled at that. She caught it at the edge of her vision, gone before she could be sure of it, and something in her chest tightened at having seen it at all. Some old reflex against noticing a man's face too closely. A reflex that had gone stiff with disuse, and ached now like a joint working after a long stillness. Inside, she set out a bowl and a heel of bread, and did not sit across from him while he ate. She stood at the stove with her back to the room, listening to the small sounds of a stranger, eating carefully, unhurried, the way a man eats when he has learned not to waste what's given him. "Barn's yours till you've earned your feed, or till the horses are broke," she said. "Whichever comes first." "Fair enough. I'm not looking for company." Didn't offer any. She almost turned around at that. She didn't. Outside, the wind found the loose shutter on the north window and worked it once, twice, a small complaint against the frame, and she thought, distantly, that she would need to fix that before the week was out. One more thing on a list that had stopped ending months ago. He was gone before she woke the next morning. She found this out by the absence of him. No shape moving past the kitchen window. No sound of the barn door dragging on its hinge. Only the shutter she had meant to fix, still now, as if the wind itself had decided to wait and see what kind of man she'd let onto the place. She went out anyway, coffee in hand, breath fogging ahead of her in the cold. The corral held 3 horses that morning, instead of the usual sullen distance between them and the fence rail. She counted twice to be sure. They stood closer together than they had in a year, ears forward, watching the barn door the way dogs watch for a hand that might feed them. She found him inside, already at work on the bay gelding's near foreleg, a rope looped loose around the animal's fetlock, his voice pitched low in a register she couldn't make into words. The gelding's skin twitched along its flank, but its head stayed down. She had tried the same thing herself, twice in October, and been thrown into the mud for her trouble. She did not mention this. "He's got a bad memory of a rope," the man said without turning. "Somebody used one wrong on him once." "You can't know that." "I can guess." He straightened, ran a hand down the gelding's neck, unhurried. "Same as I can guess nobody's mended that north stretch of fence since fall." She hadn't asked him to walk the fence line. She said nothing about it now either, only felt the small offense of being seen through, the way a woman feels when someone notices the hem she's been meaning to sew. "That fence isn't your business." Wasn't going to fix it without asking. But you looked at it. Man walks a property. He looks at what's on it. He said this plainly, no apology folded into it, and went back to the gelding's leg, as if the matter were closed. She watched his hands, broad, deliberate, unhurried in a way that made the horse's ear tip toward him instead of away, and thought of her husband's hands, which had been quick and impatient, and had loved these animals with a kind of temper that never quite settled into trust. She left the coffee cup on the rail without meaning to leave it there, walked back toward the house with the wind cutting sideways across the yard, and did not look back to see whether he drank it. That night she took the ledger down from the shelf above the stove, the one she kept out of habit more than use now, since there was little left to record but subtraction. She sat with it open a long while, the numbers unchanged, the bank's letter still folded inside the back cover where she had put it in November, and not opened since. She did not take it out. She only sat, listening to the barn's quiet at the far end of the yard, and did not yet know what a man's hands might do with a debt he had no right to touch. The bank's letter stayed folded where it was, but the cold did not stay where it was supposed to either. By the second week of December the wind had teeth in it, and she woke some mornings to frost furring the inside of the window glass in patterns she used to find pretty, before she started counting how many days of wood that meant. He was up before her most mornings now. She knew this from the tracks in the yard, single file, purposeful, leading to the barn and back to the woodpile and back to the barn again, as if he had already decided the order of the day before she'd poured her coffee. She said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. The wood by the kitchen door was simply higher than she remembered stacking it. The gray gelding came around first. She noticed that before she noticed anything else, because the gelding had been her husband's favorite and hardest disappointment. The one he swore blind was ruined past use. She stood at the paddock rail one gray afternoon and watched the man run a hand down the gelding's foreleg, slow, without looking at the animal's face, and the gelding did not pull back. It shifted its weight and let him. "He'll take a saddle by Christmas," the man said, not turning. She didn't answer right away. "He threw my husband twice, broke his wrist the second time." Wasn't listening to him. He straightened, wiped his palm on his thigh. Different thing than being mean. She thought about that longer than she meant to, walking back to the house. The words listening, turning over in her like a coin she couldn't place the value of. That was the week the child from the Hendersons' place came by with a message about a debt owed the other way, a jar of preserves, nothing, an excuse dressed as an errand, and stood in the yard staring at the man working the gelding, with the frank, unembarrassed attention children have before anyone teaches them not to stare. "Is he your new husband?" the child asked her, plain as the weather. "He's helping with the horses," she said, and the words came out steadier than she expected, though something in her chest had gone briefly, uselessly warm. The child seemed satisfied with this and ran off toward the fence line, where she noted, without meaning to note it, that 2 rotted posts near the north corner had already been pulled and set aside, replaced with green-cut lengths she hadn't ordered, and hadn't paid for, and hadn't asked anyone to fell. She stood a moment, looking at the new wood, pale against the gray winter grass, and then went inside without comment. Because there was nothing yet to say that wouldn't cost her something to say it, and she had learned, this past year, to spend as little as she could. The cold set in hard that week, the kind that cracked the water trough by morning and silvered the fence wire with frost so fine it looked sewn on. She woke before light, out of habit that had nothing to do with chores anymore, and everything to do with the particular ache of a house too quiet. And she found the stove already lit, the kettle already ticking toward a boil, though she had not heard him come in. He was gone again by the time she came downstairs, fully dressed, out to the barn where the lamp glow moved behind the cracked boards like something breathing. She did not ask him how long he had been up. She had learned that questions like that came back to her thin and unanswered, not because he meant to withhold anything, but because he did not seem to think his own hours were worth reporting. At the mending basket that afternoon, she found a coat of her husband's, the wool one gone soft with age, folded differently than she had left it, sleeves tucked in, collar turned down the way a man folds a coat when he means to wear it again, not the way it sits when it's only being stored. She held it a moment. She did not remember touching it in weeks. She put it back exactly as she'd found it, and told herself this was nothing, the kind of nothing that didn't deserve the attention she was giving it. The bank sent a letter that same week, addressed to her in a clerk's careful hand, the kind of letter she had stopped opening on the day they arrived, and instead set behind the sugar tin, where it would keep company with the others. She did not read it. She knew what it said without reading it. She had read enough of them to know the shape of the sentence before the words filled it in. That evening she watched him from the kitchen window working the young sorrel in the last light, and she noticed, the way she noticed things now, sideways, without letting herself look straight at them, that he had stopped to check the horse's near foreleg twice in as many circuits, patient as a man with nowhere better to be, though she knew for a fact he had walked 4 miles into town and back that morning on some errand he hadn't mentioned. She had seen the mud on his boots, town mud, not yard mud, and had said nothing about it, the way she said nothing about most things now, filing them instead in the quiet ledger she kept of what he did and did not explain. The letter stayed behind the sugar tin, The coat stayed folded. The post stayed green and unpaid for at the north corner, holding wire that hummed faintly in the wind, like something waiting to be noticed properly. And she went to bed that night, turning over the mud on his boots, the way she used to turn over her husband's silences, back when there had still been a husband to have silences with. The cold came down hard around the middle of December, the kind that turned the mud ruts to iron overnight, and made every step out to the barn a small negotiation with the ground. She went into town on a Tuesday for flour and coal oil, wrapped in her husband's old coat, because her own had never been warm enough, and she stood at the counter while Mr. Halloran totaled her order, with the particular slowness of a man deciding whether to say something. "Saw your hired man in here last week," he said finally, not looking up from the ledger. "He's not hired," she said. "He works for the room." Halloran wrote a number, crossed it out, wrote another. "Whatever he is, he was asking after the bank's hours. Didn't buy nothing. Just stood by the stove a while and asked." She paid for the flour and did not ask which bank hours, or why a man with no money that she knew of would need to know them. She carried the sack out to the wagon herself, refusing the boy who offered, because carrying it herself was one of the few things left that still felt like hers to decide. The whole ride home she watched the fence posts go by, the old gray ones leaning like tired men, and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding since October. What was owed, what was left, how many months the difference could be stretched before it couldn't be stretched anymore. She had stopped opening the bank's letters in November, not because she didn't know what they said, because knowing it in her own handwriting, in her own kitchen, at her own table, made it a thing she had to answer, and she had not yet found an answer that didn't end with the ranch belonging to somebody else's name. When she pulled into the yard, he was at the north corner again, driving a post with the flat of a maul, and he straightened when he heard the wagon, wiped his palm down his thigh, and came to take the reins without her asking. "Cold setting in early," he said. "It does that here." He unhitched the team without further comment, and she stood a moment in the yard watching her own breath go white in front of her, thinking about a man standing by a stove in town, asking after bank hours, and thinking that if she asked him outright, he would either lie to her plainly or tell her the truth plainly, and either way, something would shift between them that she wasn't ready to shift. So she didn't ask. She carried the mail sack in from the wagon bed and set it on the porch step and went inside to start the stove and left him to finish the post in the failing light. Supper was quiet that night. It was quiet most nights, but this quiet had a different weight to it, the kind that sits in the throat instead of the room. She set 2 plates. She always set 2 plates now, without remembering when that had started, without remarking on it either. He ate like a man who had learned not to waste what was in front of him, elbows close to his body, and when he finished, he carried his own plate to the basin without being told, the way he'd done since the 2nd week. And she still hadn't gotten used to it, the small, unasked-for competence of it. "Post holes are frozen 2 feet down already," he said, drying his hands on the cloth by the basin. "Won't get the rest of the line in before the ground locks. How much is left?" 60 yards, maybe less." She nodded, like it was only a fact about fencing. Later, after the lamp was out and the house had gone to its settling sounds, she lay awake, doing the arithmetic again, the same numbers in the dark that she'd done in the daylight, and they came out the same. She thought about the letters stacked unopened in the tin behind the flour. How many now? 4, 5? She thought about the man in town by the stove, whoever he'd been talking to, and what a drifter would want with bank hours unless he was fixing to leave and needed to know when a place opened so he could be first through the door for some reason of his own, or unless he was fixing to stay and needed to know something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with him leaving. She did not let herself finish that thought either. In the morning, the frost had laid itself thick and white over everything, over the porch rail and the hitching post and the top slats of the corral. and when she came out with the coffee pot to fill the basin, she saw he was already at the barn, breath rising off him in a column, working the last of the yearlings on a long line in the cold, with a patience that hadn't shortened even a little since November. She stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to, watching the horse circle him, watching him not raise his voice, not raise his hand, just turn with the animal, like the two of them were tied by something more honest than rope. Then she went back inside before he could look up and find her watching. The bank envelope came on a Tuesday, carried up from town by the boy who ran errands for the store, and she almost didn't open it standing at the counter. She set it against the sugar tin the way she set everything that could wait, and went back to the bread she was kneading, flour to her elbows, and did not think of it again until the boy was gone and the kitchen was quiet and her hands were clean. Inside was the ledger page from the bank, the one she'd been sent every quarter for 4 years, the one that always carried the same red figure at the bottom no matter how she scraped. This one did not. She read it twice, standing at the counter with flour still caught under one thumbnail. The figure at the bottom was not red. It was a different hand's ink, and it said, "Paid in full." And under that the teller's initials, and under that nothing else at all. She did not call out to the barn. She folded the page along its old crease and set it back where it had been, tucked under the tin, the way a person sets down something too heavy to be seen holding. That evening she watched him at supper for anything, a held breath, a look that lingered a half-second too long, some seam in the plain way he asked for the salt, and there was nothing. He ate the way he always ate, without hurry, without comment, and when he was done, he thanked her the same 3 words he always used, and went out to check the stock before dark, same as any other night, as though the world had not shifted an inch under either of them. She lay awake past the point where the house had gone fully quiet, past the point where she could hear him moving in the loft, and did the arithmetic she had refused to do in daylight. What 4 years of unpaid interest came to. What a man made breaking horses for other ranches on the side. Evenings she hadn't asked about. Sundays he'd claimed for himself and she had not questioned, because a man was owed his Sundays. She did not arrive at a comfortable number. She arrived at one that told her exactly how long he must have been carrying this before the ink dried. In the morning, she did not thank him. She poured his coffee the way she always poured it, and set it at his place, and said nothing about ledgers or figures, or the particular silence a man keeps when he has done something he does not intend to be asked about. But when he came in from the barn at noon, stamping frost off his boots at the door, she was standing at the window with her arms folded, watching the north pasture where the old fence sagged gray and half-fallen against the white field, and she said without turning, "That fence won't hold through the thaw." He looked at it a long moment. "No," he said, "it won't." He started on the north fence the next morning before she had finished her coffee. She heard the wagon first, the particular creak of the axle he'd never gotten around to greasing, and then the sound of it stopping at the tree line, where the old posts leaned like tired men. From the kitchen window, she watched him unload cedar rails he must have cut and split somewhere she hadn't seen, stacked and seasoned, more of them than a few days' work could account for. She did not go out to ask where the wood had come from. By the 3rd day, the questions had answers she could read without asking. A neighbor's boy rode past on an errand and slowed at the gate, calling out that his father said thank you for the lumber money, and would the roan be ready by March. She stood at the fence post counting the rails already set. 12, 14, more than could have come from one man's evenings, and understood that whatever he had settled at the bank had not been the whole of it. There had been a debt to a neighbor too, small, old, the kind that accrues in favors rather than dollars, and never gets written down, and never gets forgiven either, only carried. He had gone and settled that too. She brought him coffee at midday without being asked, the way she had begun to, and stood at the half-finished line while he drove a post into ground still hard with frost at the edges. His hands were raw. He did not favor them. "You didn't have to trade for the wood," she said. Wasn't trading. He set the maul down and took the cup. Broke his gelding last fall. He never called it even. He called it even now. Some men wait for cause. He drank. Don't need much. She looked at the line of new rails running pale against the old gray wood, half the fence already changed, and thought of how long a thing could stand half-mended before anyone noticed. It had begun to lean less. She thought of the note under the sugar tin, and the lumber account she had not asked about, and the particular arithmetic of a man who did not announce what he carried until it was already carried. "You'll want gloves," she said, "before your hands crack open in this cold." "Haven't yet." "You will." He didn't argue it. He picked the maul back up, and she stood a moment longer than she needed to, watching the rhythm of it. Swing, strike, the frost shaking loose from the old posts, before she turned back toward the house, where the bread was rising and the stove wanted tending, and did not look back to see if he watched her go. The bread came out at noon, and she set it on the sill to cool the way she always did. Though the house had grown a habit of 2 loaves instead of 1, she had stopped noticing when that started. She noticed it now, looking at the second loaf, and did not examine why. By afternoon, the wind had dropped and the sky gone, the flat white of coming snow. She rode out to check the mare he'd been gentling, the one that had come in wild-eyed in November, striking at anything that came near her stall. She found the mare standing quiet at the rail, head low, letting the wind move her mane without flinching from it. She did not go in. She watched from the fence a while, the way she might watch weather change, and then she went back. That evening he came in later than usual, snow starting to catch in his collar, and said nothing about where he'd been. She noticed the mud on his boots was the red clay from the low pasture past the north line. Ground she had no cause to send him to. Ground where the old well sat capped and half forgotten since her husband's time. She set his plate down without asking. "Well's still good," he said, like she'd asked. "Checked the cap, rotted some, fixed it. Nobody's used that well in 3 years. Somebody ought to." She sat across from him and ate slower than usual, turning that over. A well nobody used, fixed by a man who owed her nothing more than a barn to sleep in and a debt he'd already called even. "You keep finding work nobody sent you to do," she said. "Land tells you what it needs. Don't have to be sent." She looked at him a long moment, the lamp between them throwing his face half in shadow, and thought that her husband had said something close to that once, years back, about the fence line that had finally given out this winter. Land telling you, if you listened. She had listened for 3 years and heard nothing but the wind. "You'll freeze if it keeps up like this," she said, nodding toward the barn. "Barn's warm enough. Wasn't asking." He looked up at that, something moving behind his eyes she didn't have a name for and didn't reach for one. Outside, the snow had thickened, coming down straight and quiet, no wind behind it now, and the second loaf sat cooling on the sill between them, like a fact neither one of them was ready to say out loud. She got up to bank the stove for the night, and did not tell him to stay in, and did not tell him to go, and he sat a while longer at her table before he rose, thanked her plain, and went out into the snow toward the barn, without being asked to hurry. The snow held through the week, and under it the ranch went quiet in a way that felt earned rather than empty. She woke one morning to find the path to the barn already shoveled, a narrow trench cut clean through drift that had come up past her knees the night before. He hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't asked. The last of the horses gave in that Thursday. A gray gelding, older than the rest, who had thrown every hand that came near him since her husband died, and no one had touched him since. She watched from the porch, arms crossed against the cold, as the drifter stood in the round pen doing nothing at all for the better part of an hour, just standing, letting the animal circle and blow and finally slow, finally stop, finally lower its head to within reach of his open palm. He didn't call her out to see it. She came anyway and stood at the rail and said nothing, and he didn't look over to see if she was proud. That evening she went looking for the ledger to mark the last of it. Every horse gentled, every name crossed through, and found instead that the drawer where she kept the bank papers had been opened and closed with more care than she used. Nothing missing that she could tell. A faint smell of tobacco on the pages that wasn't hers. She sat with the drawer open a long minute, turning it over, and put it down to the wind getting into the house the way it did that time of year, finding every gap in a doorframe that had gone soft with age. She didn't ask him about it at supper. She watched instead how he ate, steady, unhurried, same as always, and how his hands, when they weren't working, lay flat and still on the table, like a man accustomed to waiting on something he wasn't going to hurry into being. The days shortened further and then, almost without her noticing the hinge of it, began to lengthen again. The light came earlier. The icicles off the eaves dripped by midday before freezing hard again by dusk. A small daily argument between seasons that the cold was slowly losing. She caught herself, one such afternoon, standing at the window longer than the task in her hands required, watching him mend a length of the north fence that had been down since before he arrived, hammer going in a rhythm she'd come to know the sound of from any room in the house. She went back to her mending. The sound kept on outside, patient, unbothered, like something that had already decided how the winter would end. The thaw came on a Tuesday, though she didn't think to mark it as such until later, when the whole shape of the week had already settled into something she'd want to remember. She went into the kitchen before light to start the stove and reached for the sugar tin the way she had 10,000 mornings before this one. It didn't sit right. A corner of paper showed under its base, folded twice, gone soft at the creases, the way paper goes when it has been carried a long time in a coat pocket before finally being set down. She unfolded it standing at the counter, still in her nightclothes, the stove unlit behind her. The note from the bank, paid in full, her name on it, and a date from 3 weeks back, and the teller's small, cramped signature beside a line that said the balance owed was 0. She read it twice. Then she stood there with it in both hands and did not move. The house was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a morning before the fires caught, and outside she could hear the mare shifting in her stall, and under that, fainter, the sound of a currycomb working in long, even strokes. She set the note back down where she'd found it, not hidden this time, just set. She poured 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, careful with the second, the way she hadn't been careful in longer than she could count, and carried them both out across the yard in her boots, and her coat thrown over her nightclothes, the cold biting at her ankles, the mud from the thaw sucking at her heels. He didn't hear her until she was at the rail. He turned his head, comb still moving down the mare's shoulder in that same patient rhythm, and looked at her standing there in her coat with 2 cups steaming in the morning air. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask anything. She set 1 cup on the rail beside him. He looked at it, then at her. Then he went back to the mare, the comb moving slow and even, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer, the only kind he'd ever given her, the kind that had been answering her all winter, without her once having to ask the question out loud. She didn't go back inside. She stood at the rail with her own cup warming her hands, watching the mare's coat come up glossy under his strokes, watching the light come up pale and new over the ridge behind the north fence he'd mended, board by board, without once mentioning it was done. The steam rose off both cups into the cold. Neither of them moved to end it.